How to Draw. The book everyone knows, most of you have, but none of you use. Am I right? Now, there's a reason for that, but a lot of you don't know what that reason is. And in this video, I'm going to explain to you exactly why that is. Because most of you say, well, it confuses me. That might be true, but you don't know why it confuses you. So that's what I want to explain in this video. Now, to give you some context, and as a disclaimer, I have used this book. I like this book. I love this book, but it might not be the book for you. This book helped me in my journey towards becoming a professional in the games industry. Now, there's a big reason for that. It's not necessarily because I'm smarter than you or I'm not easily confused, but I'm a lot more analytical. I love to break things down. One of the big reasons I started Artwod. But in this book, there's a couple of assumptions. And this is probably why I don't like the fact that this book is being promoted as a book for beginners. It's not a book for beginners. Okay, let's just get that out of the way. It's not a book for beginners, especially if you want to learn how to draw intuitively, forget it. However, it's still a fantastic book. Now, it's also a good book for people that love to be more analytical about how they want to learn how to draw. Look, I have a lot of product design books. I think product design has helped me massively with understanding perspective. So yes, it's a fundamental skill, but no, it's not necessarily for beginners. And so I'm going to break that down in this video. So again, what I said, this book assumes you know a lot of things. And what I say by that is that it assumes you have an understanding of 3D space, meaning that you understand y-axis, x-axis, z-axis, although they brush over it, like they don't really explain it in depth. It's like, this is the concept, now we're applying these concepts. So that's where it can start to get very confusing very fast for a lot of you. And it's that assumption that actually makes it confusing. Now, even if you get past that, there's still a lot of difficulties. And the main difficulty is that the way the book, and it's from Scott Robertson, by the way, fantastic product designer, but it's the way that the book sort of leads you into a very technical space of drawing. And so I'm going to break that down. I'm going to draw a bit because we're an art channel after all. I'm going to break it down a bit just to give you a better sort of insight into why you might be getting confused. Getting into it, right? I'm not going to review the book. Most of you know the book. If you don't, definitely get it if you want to, because it's a great book. I still like it, but I don't use it as often, but I still like it as a book. But getting into it, you can see that already there's a lot of technicalities when it comes to drawing. How to, work with your lines, how to think about perspective, but that's a bit brushed over. And then it goes into mostly measuring stuff. And so this is where that first assumption of the book is wrong, is that you have an intuitive spatial awareness. And I know this is wrong because I made an entire beginner road on getting people intuitive in perspective. And it turns out to be a lot harder than even I thought it was. So that's the assumption here. And that's one of the big reasons you get very confused very fast. So what's happening in the book and what they try to explain very, very well, by the way, they do it very well in terms of explaining. But what they are explaining is how you can accurately measure things in an intuitive way or even an analytical way so that you start to draw accurate 3D proportions on a 2D plane. That's actually the entire premise of this book. How to draw with a technical accuracy, because this is a product design book. It goes into 3D eventually, right? Product designers make sketches that will be translated into sculpts and 3D, and not just willy-nilly. They're being translated into actual products. So there's architecture behind it. There needs to be technicality behind it, right? Most of this nowadays gets actually translated to 3D directly. But this book is more for people that want to get into that very technical aspect of drawing. And so that's why to some degree, the title is misleading. Great title for a book, but it is misleading. So what they're trying to teach you here is how you can mirror objects in space, how you can measure objects in space and then mirror them on the other side, how you can find proportions in space, how you can make complexity out of drawings, right? And how you can start with something simple and make it seemingly complex. Now, the biggest issue that this book has is that the way that they approach it is counterintuitive to what the creative design process is. And so that's what I want to explain in today's video, is that what they do in How to Draw, what Scott Robertson does, is what I call outward design. So what is outward design? Well, you can see it very much so in these drawings here, right? So what they're doing is they're drawing outward, meaning that they start with a center line. So a center line in this case, right? Center line like this in a certain perspective. And then they will start drawing that perspective or that center line outward. The first thing they do is actually map out a ground plane. So they're starting to map out like what's the total width of the object that we're drawing in space? How is that reflected on the other side? So how is that mirrored? And then what are the cross sections that we are drawing onto this wireframe, right? We're literally drawing wireframes in perspective. But my God, if you're not used to any of that, you are getting into trouble really, really fast. So that's by far the main reason why people get confused with this book. So again, I want to reiterate, it's not because it's a bad book. It's because the application of it is so technical and what I would argue pretty advanced that it confuses the people that don't have an intuitive sense of space in the first place. And so this is almost a direct opposite of what I teach at Artwod. And I'm not trying to promote Artwod here. I'm always promoting Artwod, but I'm not trying to promote this specific, like this versus that. I'm just trying to tell you the concept that works much better for beginners because we've seen it work much better for beginners. And they create and cultivate a much better sense of depth and perspective because of it. So instead of going into space with complexity, like complicated, let's say, planes that we then project and then we rotate, we mirror, and all of that, what we tend to do with Artwod is we say, right, let's assume this is the end result for now. So let's look at the end result. So the end result, if we were to draw it, is almost like half a boat, right? Like this, and then like this, and then there's a bit more width in the middle. Not perfect, but let's say this is our end result. If this is the end result, what we do is like, we sort of reverse engineer it, but we don't start from a plane in the center and then go outward, because then we already have to understand what is the end result going to look like. Otherwise, I'm just guessing a plane, and then it's almost like I'm just concepting along the way. That doesn't really work. We want to sort of be able to envision an end goal and then work towards it. This is why this is very hard. So what we tend to do is like, okay, what is the simplest representation of this? So that would be half a cylinder. So half a cylinder like this. You're like, whoa, half a cylinder? Yeah, you first need to know a cylinder, of course, right? So we take it back to the basic, like we first need to understand a box in perspective, and we need to understand that a cylinder can exist within that box. And then we need to get intuitive about how to draw cylinders in space and all of that. And then we need to be able to cut that cylinder in half so that we can create half a cylinder, right? So you see there's quite a few steps before we even get to half a cylinder. But once we get to half a cylinder, then we are like, okay, we understand half a cylinder. We understand the contour lines that surround half a cylinder. And now what we're going to do is we're going to start the first step towards what we call at Artwod form manipulation. So that means that we're now going to learn how to bend forms. We're now going to learn how to inflate a form. We're going to learn how to taper forms. First step we do is like, okay, is there some kind of manipulation going on? Yes, there is. Or is there some type of combination going on? Yes, there is also. So that's what we tend to look at. So we're like, okay, what type of manipulation is going on here? And I would say, well, we can say that maybe the contour lines are being inflated in the middle. Cool. Yes, we can say that. We can say that there's some type of tapering going on towards the front. Yes, we can also say that. So that means that maybe step one, our first iteration, before we even get here, is, okay, I understand that there's, if I draw the contour lines, I understand that there's some type of tapering so that we start with a smaller half a cylindrical or half a sphere in perspective, and then they become bigger and then maybe become smaller again, right? So then we understand like, okay, my shape is starting to look like this. Let's say we can draw through the lines. We can draw through the shape, right? So that's our first step, that we now understand that there is some form of manipulation going on. And then we can see, okay, how do we now get closer to the actual result? Well, there's also some type of contour manipulation going on. What does contour manipulation mean? Well, instead of the cross section that I've drawn here, that for half a cylinder always just remains half a sphere, now it's not half a sphere, it is, what we look here, it's more of a rectangular shape with a flat top and rounded corners. All right, so then we start to draw that in perspective and we get much closer to this. Now, actually, in actuality, if I were to translate this to this, we would have this, and then this is what we would see. Then as a last step, another type of form manipulation would be the combination of form. So that means like if I want to get to this, I also need to add a small piece to the front. In that case, that would be what we call a quarter sphere, right? So that quarter sphere gets added to that front of the object with the same manipulation going on. So you can see there's quite a few steps before we get to that result. And you can see that it makes more sense that you can start to first learn about just form simplicity in space, and you get intuitive with that. And when you get intuitive with that, you can, just like a sculptor or a modeler would, start to manipulate that form, bend it to your will, and get to the result you want. Because the alternative, or the direct opposite in this case, would be to design outward, but that is assuming you have an incredible understanding of perspective and form in space intuitively. And this is why that can, and this is actually the reason why this book gets or becomes very hard for you to understand. So to put this in practical terms, is what they're doing here is very closely related to like the early stages of 3D software. The early stages of 3D software is where you design things in 3D using the orthographic views, meaning you design the side view, you design the top view, you design the front view, and based on that, you calibrate how that becomes a thing in 3D. And this is what they're doing here. They're actually designing the side view in perspective already. They're designing the top view. They're designing the front view. And combined, that creates this result. It works, but you need a very good and intuitive understanding of all of the X, Y, and Z axes in space. And if you don't have that, you're basically screwed. Now, what we do at Artwod is we say, what you should understand is you start with a very rough and simple form, and now we're going to manipulate that form and sculpt it until we get closer towards what we want here. And we do that by applying the techniques that we call at Artwod form manipulation. And so that form manipulation really better helps us understand objects in 3D. Now, why do we want to understand objects in 3D? Well, because if we want to draw people in scenes, or we want to draw illustrations, we need to create the illusion of 3D. And the illusion of 3D is going to help us create great art. But in order to do that, we do need to understand simple objects or manipulated objects in 3D, because it's not necessarily about this half a boat that I'm drawing here. It's also like, if I want to draw an arm, I need to understand that an arm isn't just a cylinder. I need to understand that that arm, let's say the lower arm, is basically a mannequinized version that is connected to the upper arm in some way, like this, right? It's connected to the upper arm, but is basically a manipulated version of that cylinder with a lot of contour manipulation going on. But that's essentially what makes you understand form in 3D space much better. Well, at least in my opinion. What advice do I have for you? Okay, as I said, I'm not promoting Artwod. I'm just telling you how you will probably have a much easier time understanding 3D form in space. So what I recommend you do, especially if you already have the How to Draw book, don't sell it, don't burn it. It's a fantastic book. If you have it, don't start with it necessarily. Start to first understand simple objects in 3D and how you can manipulate them. But then what you should do is you should revisit this book from time to time, page through it, and then see if you can understand the concepts that are being taught here with the way that you have been learning simple form in 3D. And what you should do, and this is something that has to do with expectation management, which I think is kind of the wrong messaging of the book. But how you should treat this book is, you should think that this book isn't going to teach you how to draw, but it's going to massively teach you about perspective. Massively. I cannot recommend that book enough when it comes to learning perspective. So what you should do is you should do snippets of the book with a mind of, I'm going to just enforce my fundamental understanding of perspective. It's not going to help me make pretty designs or pretty drawings. It's just going to massively help me with my perspective. If you have that mindset and you supplement your learning with this book, it's a fantastic book. So it's not necessarily about learning concept art or learning illustration. It's about the fundamental understanding of perspective. And I don't think there's a lot of books that are better when it comes to that. But I feel like there's a layer underneath that you should first understand, which is the sole reason I made the beginner road at Artwod, is to help people actually understand form in 3D space intuitively. And I say intuitively a lot, and maybe some of you that word kind of gets lost. Like, what does he mean with intuitive drawing? It means that I don't need to draw a horizon line and vanishing points to point my objects or to point my guidelines towards that point to find or give the illusion of a box in space. And then afterwards have to recalibrate, remeasure how I'm going to now add another box to this space, right? Again, by following those lines, because that's not intuitive. I'm literally following rules. Intuitive means that I have a good concept of perspective, whether it's 1 point, 2 point, 3 point, 5 point, doesn't really matter. I have an intuitive sense of it. And because of that, I can just comfortably draw a box in 2D or 2-point perspective, and I can add a rotated box next to it, and I can add another box on top of it or underneath it, because I have an intuitive sense. Is this technically correct? No, but it looks believable. And that's what you should aim for. Is you want to aim for believability, because that's all you want. It's like, is my art believable? It's not, is it realistic? Is it believable? And when it becomes believable, it becomes good. That's the thing. Once your art becomes very believable, whether it's cartoony, stylized, anime, realism, stylized realism, hyperrealism, when it becomes believable, that's when it becomes really good. And so That's why this book can supplement that learning on how to get more technical about perspective and increase that believability, but it shouldn't be your starting point. That's all I have to say. All right? So with that said, start, as I always say, with the true fundamentals. And as always, happy learning and happy drawing.